What does not kill us makes us stronger. The ever-increasing role of military leaders and the army in the political life of the Republic was clearly killing it. Therefore, Octavian Augustus, in the framework of large-scale reforms that covered most of the spheres of life of the state, almost most of all reformed the army. His main task was to reduce the independence of military commanders in matters not directly related to the conduct of hostilities. The liberty in determining the goals of military campaigns had to come to an end. Now the entire military administration was strictly closed to the figure of the princeps, emperor. Questions of financing the army as well as war and peace were now decided only by the emperor. The military strategy was necessarily coordinated with him, and legates watched all actions of the commander, especially those connected with the booty. Because the war was now a personal matter of the emperor, all the booty was the booty of the emperor, as well as all the triumphs. Now only the emperor could accept triumphs, and only in a small number of exceptions were allowed to successful commanders. And as the nature of the state's attitude to war changed, so did all the habits and value systems associated with it. Of course, the most radical change was in the position of the soldiers. During the crisis of the Republic, they were the motor that by the mere fact of their existence demanded constant warfare. After all, the soldiers want money, and the main revenue of the budget of the Republic gave the war. So it is necessary to fight and take as much booty as possible. Octavian, systematizing the system of allowances for soldiers, brought it to the fact that the soldiers began to receive quite good money and without any wars. In addition to the salary due to each legionary, were given and donations in honor of important dates and events for the government. Soldiers received this money from the emperor. The commander was only a transfer link, and therefore loyalty to the emperor, as long as the money was, should be stronger than loyalty to the commander. Moreover, the emperor guaranteed the soldiers a land plot for their service, which would provide for them until their old age. Thus, the key role in the welfare of soldiers became not wars, from whose booty they received money, but the emperor, who collected this very money by taxes. Of course, part of the booty from the wars, the soldiers still received the same, but now the appeal of eternal war for the sake of plunder was no longer great. And the fact that all the relatively rich territories Rome had already seized also had quite a serious impact. The military commanders, now acting as the emperor's hands in deciding military matters, also had a slightly different motivation. It became almost impossible to get some incredible wealth and make political connections in the conquered lands. The share of the booty was determined personally by the emperor, and was not so great. Much more important were bonuses not directly related to the loot from the military campaign. Appointments, gifts of land and fame and prestige from imperial propaganda. As a result, the measure of a successful war became not the amount of captured wealth, but the fulfillment of the goals set by the emperor. Plebs. The urban plebs of Rome should be divided from all the others, as here the attitude to wars divided a small but a gulf. The rural plebs in principle, after the reform of Maria, experienced war on their own skin only in cases of barbarian invasions in the border regions. Extraordinary taxes for wars became a thing of the past with the Republic, and even there they were rare. Only volunteers joined the army. A Roman agrarian could have lived his whole life and never known that Rome was at war somewhere out there. But he did, because the propaganda in one form or another informed him of this information. That the emperor's soldiers were fighting for this world to continue, that Rome was so great that all enemies would fall down before it, and whoever did not fall would know Gladius. And it worked perfectly well. A Roman paid taxes and knew that for these taxes somewhere out there the emperor's soldiers were crushing wild barbarians. Stories about new wars and victories gave the plebs confidence that it will be like that, eternal, august peace. And consequently support of emperor was high while Roman legions fought and won. But the plebs of the city of Rome had in addition and quite a selfish motive. Each successful war ended in triumph and festivities paid from the treasury. Discussing what will be the gifts in honor of the next triumph were a favorite thing for the townspeople in the period of the late Republic, and nothing has changed now. The greatness of Rome for them was not an empty sound, but had quite concrete manifestations in everyday life, and therefore the urban plebs loved wars and prayed to the gods for their successful completion. Nobility. Since the issues of war and peace from the Senate finally left the Senate, and the subjectivity of military commanders and viceroys greatly reduced, suddenly, for the gentlemen of the aristocrats became much more important to properly suck up to the emperor, or to whoever wants to overthrow him. Wars now had no direct effect on their position. Moreover, the land in the conquered territories was now distributed mainly by the emperor, and therefore the ideological factor became more and more important in military actions. And finally, the emperor and his entourage. Here again, the economic aspect was sacrificed to the political and ideological. The key task of emperors was to maintain power over the state, which was impossible without maintaining the army. The army was maintained by taxes, and maintaining the tax base was a key task. Emperors could not rely on irregular military booty, as this would put them in an extremely vulnerable position, and so the issue of financing the army and the survival of the state was a priority. The defensive strategy won out. The fundamental outlines of this defensive strategy have remained unchanged for centuries. It is the principle of strike first. Wide intelligence networks scattered over all border territories should have allowed the Romans to reveal the preparation of the enemy to attack. Roman diplomacy tried to constantly put sticks in the wheels, bringing confusion, that in the tribes of the Germans, that in the elites of Parthia. Advancement of legions was made only at the moment when the threat of invasion became inevitable and it was necessary to buy it. It was not always possible, and sometimes invasions occurred unexpectedly for the Romans, which led to large-scale devastation and confirmation of the principles of the strategy itself. Thus Rome, even without plans for territorial additions, could conduct large-scale aggressive military campaigns outside its own borders. Their goal was to instill fear that if you looked askew at Rome, the evil Romans would come and kill you. An extremely spectacular and effective tactic, as fear of Rome caused barbarians and weak neighbors to ingratiate themselves to Rome and seek compromise. Again, it did not always help. Sometimes the Romans overreached and caused rather the opposite effect. But it was corrected by good old ultra-violence, which did instill in the survivors a sufficient level of horror that they would not try to repeat it in the near future. At the same time, even within the framework of a defensive strategy, the expansion of the empire, at least during the Principate, was perceived as a necessary action. It may be argued that emperors derived most of their wealth from wars, and that is true, but it was a nice bonus, not an end in itself. The emperors had a much easier way to supplement their personal income, confiscating the property of state criminals. Plus, the emperors themselves were extremely poor, and imperial lands occupied a huge share of the empire's space, bringing in a steady income. And this income went not only for the construction of palaces and entertainment, but also for the organization of festivals, the work of the bureaucracy, awards, and eventually wars. Yes, on the newly conquered territories, emperors could organize a lot of new farms and could simply confiscate them from the offenders for free. There was only one problem with territorial conquests. Rome had too small an army for an aggressive foreign policy. Legions under the emperors were barely enough to wage a full-scale war on one of the borders and passive defense on the others. Major offensives, like the regular wars with Parthia, required such a weakening of other borders that wars inevitably broke out there. Therefore, no matter how much the Romans did not want to take over the world, but they could not do it.